Sometimes life works in mysterious ways, as if a superior force really wanted to demonstrate that everything that goes around comes around, positively and negatively. Today, we are going to tell the touching story of a woman who had her life changed because of a simple gesture. Every day after work, Robert took the subway home to avoid traffic. He worked in a Home Depot store, and some days he had to work harder than others. He slept almost every day on the way, and some co-workers that took the same transportation would wake him up so he wouldn't miss the stop. Although this time he was alone, and he would end up stopping at the final stop. He had been sleeping for over 20 minutes after he passed through where he normally stopped, until he opened his eyes and noticed he was almost reaching the other side of town. He looked around, and there was only one girl sitting next to him. "Hi," she said when she saw he was looking at her. "I see you were kind of lost, aren't you?" "Yes, I missed my stop. I'll have some problems at work today," he replied with a shy smile. They looked at each other with curiosity, and they talked until the next stop, where the woman had to get off. Rob accompanied her and got off at the same place to get the subway back. But before saying goodbye, he asked her name. "My name is Blake," she answered. Her voice was music to his ears, and when he got to work, his boss scolded him, but he felt good anyways. He thought about Blake that whole day, and on the next morning, he decided to take the subway almost at the same time as the day before to try to run into the young woman again. He was lucky because as soon as he got in, his eyes met hers. Blake smiled widely, and she called him to sit next to her. Rob and Blake continued from where they stopped, and it was so easy for both of them to talk about any subject. Their connection was instant, and after that day, they never got apart again. They decided to meet the next day, and the two started dating shortly afterwards. Both of them worked very hard and had a busy life, but they always supported each other throughout the difficult times. One day, Rob asked Blake to marry him, and a few years later, they had their first son called Ian, who became the most important thing in their lives. They built a nice, humble house together and lived happily until one day, Blake's health started to deteriorate. All of a sudden, she started coughing mysteriously and having difficulties breathing, but she didn't bother to investigate. Even though Rob said she should look into it, Blake always ended up convincing him with an air of optimism that she was fine. If Robert had known where it would end, he would never have allowed Blake to postpone appointments for so long. A few months later, the worst was about to happen. Blake woke up and preferred to believe that it was nothing serious. So she started her morning routine normally, but 2 hours later, her condition got worse, and Rob called an ambulance. As soon as the ambulance arrived, Robert was reassured by the doctors that she would be fine. Blake went with the doctors in an ambulance and fell into a coma on the way, and she was admitted straight to the ICU. On the way to the hospital, Ian asked, "How is Mom? Is she going to be fine?" And his father said, trying to hide his tears, "Of course she will, son. Mommy is strong." But when they entered the hospital lobby, they had to wait for hours until the nurse on duty said the doctor in charge needed to talk to Rob. The old doctor called him and said, "We are sorry. We tried everything to save her, but your wife was in a very advanced stage of a severe tuberculosis that affected her nervous system, and there was nothing else we could have done. Now you have to be strong." The doctor left, and Rob wept in silence, while his son Ian was with the nurse at the waiting room. He tried to recover and finally took his son by the hand and they drove home. Robert couldn't contain the tears running down his face, and his son kept asking, "Daddy, why are you crying? Where is Mommy?" But he couldn't say a word at that moment. After his wife's death, Robert did what he could to ensure a dignified life for Ian. He worked overtime in the store and earned the respect of his superiors as time went by. One day, on his way to work, a skinny and pale girl approached him and said, "Please, sir, I'm sorry to ask, but would you have some money to help me? I'm very hungry." Rob noticed that the girl was really embarrassed. He opened his wallet and noticed that he only had a few coins and a $20 bill. After thinking for a few seconds, he handed the bill to the girl and also gave her the meatball sandwich that would be his lunch. "Here you go, dear. I work in that store over there, so don't worry. It won't be the first time I have to improvise lunch," the man said amicably. "Thank you, sir. I promise to pay you back," said the little girl with teary eyes. Rob's kindness touched the little girl's heart more than the money, because normally it was as if she was invisible to everyone. Rob smiled at her and headed towards the store. He didn't know that the little girl had really made a promise to herself to pay him back. Rob returned home that night, hungry. He only drank water for lunch. The name of the girl who had asked him for the money was Bella, and her family situation was really vulnerable. Her parents were alcoholics, and they didn't seem to really care about her. 11 years passed, as if they were days. Rob had been promoted because of his hard work and had bought a bike for Ian. The boy spent all afternoon riding with his friends around the neighborhood, jumping on ramps and skidding on the sidewalk. And one day, while they were racing in a trail in the park, Ian lost his balance and hit the tree very hard. His friends were scared when they realized that Ian was answering, but he couldn't get up. Some people approached, called an ambulance, and called Robert, who left work in a hurry. "Tell me, what happened to my son?" Rob asked the doctor. The doctor said, "At the moment, Ian's life is not in danger, but we have a problem." The doctor struggled to find the right words but said, "Unfortunately, the boy has a broken back and he has a small possibility to be able to walk again." Seeing how worried the father was, he added, "There is still hope. There are specialized hospitals with advanced treatments for this kind of injuries, but unfortunately, these operations are extremely expensive. Depending on the treatment time, it can reach millions." "What? I have nowhere to get that money," said Rob. The doctor was silent. A month later, Ian was already at home, but now it was up to him how to move well with the wheelchair and getting used to the life of a person with a disability. Over the next few years, Rob sacrificed everything in order to save money for his son's treatment. He sold his old car, the TV, and had to find a second job to be able to pay everything. Ian, by this time, had become a handsome man and did what he could to deal with what happened to him in the past. Robert went into depression after failing in his attempt to raise funds for the treatment for his son. He had simply lost faith, and when his hope had already run out, someone knocked on his door. When Robert opened the door, he saw a well-dressed woman who looked almost 30 years old. "Hi, Robert. You probably won't recognize me." The stranger smiled and Rob agreed. The young woman opened her wallet and there was only a $20 bill in it and handed it to Rob. At that point, he remembered everything. He looked the girl in the eyes and remembered that embarrassed look from 15 years ago that now had disappeared. Now the girl was there, mature, conveying confidence. The young woman asked if she could come in and said her name was Bella. At that moment, Ian appeared in the room in his wheelchair and smiled sweetly to greet the visitor. Bella was embarrassed and her face immediately reddened, as if she was a little girl again. But she composed herself and asked how Robert was doing. The girl hadn't forgotten how Rob treated her 15 years before, and now, after having made her name as a great businesswoman, she decided to look for him. During that time, she lived in the city and only returned to the small town to fulfill the promise she made in the past, the promise to pay the debt. She remembered that Rob worked at the store, and that's where she got the address she needed. What she did not expect was to find a man with serious problems and a son with a disability. When Bella heard about the physical problem Ian had and possible solutions, she thought for a moment and said, "Rob, you may not know this, but 15 years ago you saved me. Back then, $20 meant I would have something to eat for some days, but your gesture gave me the hope I needed at the time to get where I am now. It may seem too much, but it was really important. So that's why I want to reimburse you and cover all the costs of Ian's treatment." The room was silent. Rob was speechless, and Ian approached hugging Bella, and she swept, letting her tears well up in her eyes. The young businesswoman remembered that when she was 12 years old, she was asking for money from that man that she was now helping. 4 weeks later, after a successful surgery, Ian took his first steps on his own. During that important event, Rob and Bella were standing next to him to make sure they could assist him if needed, but after that day, he only got better and started walking normally after a short time. Bella has fallen in love with Ian, and he intended to ask her to marry him. They got married, and Robert felt a happiness that he thought he could never feel, but life has mysterious ways to show us that there is always hope for better days, especially for those who are constantly trying to be the best version of themselves. If you know any similar stories, write about it in the comments, like the video, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more fantastic stories.